Hey everybody, Pastor Kevin here bringing you this week's curriculum, the group guidance for the curriculum. We are in the chapter titled Cross-Shaped Kingdom on page 28. And let's go ahead and jump straight in. Question number 1. Describe someone you know who has done very well by earthly standards. What did it take to get there? Would they say it was worth it? This question is just the icebreaker. It's intended to bring you to the point of just kind of talking about examples of people that maybe have done well and also and it's good to have positive and negative examples. You might have someone who's just stuck in the materialistic, consumerist world that we're in and they're loving every minute of it. And you could also, in those same senses, maybe there's some shallowness you could point out. And then there's others that maybe they've done very well and they've recognized how they've been chasing things that are difficult. And part of the reason for getting into this is that one of the major themes of this section is suffering. It's when we are following Jesus, the whole idea is deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. So it's deny yourself unto death and follow. Right? And where does Jesus go? He goes to death, right? He chooses the sacrificial way. So part of this is just to understand kind of the opposite, people who get caught in that other side of things. Question number 2. What would you say is the opposite of denying oneself and taking up one's cross? Can you give an example from your own life? This should open up a can for everybody. It's one of those things where you figure out, look at your own life. And maybe it would be good, because it's so early in the questions, to come back around to this and say, hey, now rethink that after you've gone through more of the questions and more of the content. Think about it. Are there ways that your life shows that you don't deny yourself, right? And again, if you're denying yourself and taking up your cross, again, this is the idea of death, sacrifice and death that are somehow linked. Denying yourself is not just oh, I'm not going to have ice cream tonight. I believe this passage is talking far more than that. I want to say I believe. I think that's what, if you read it just on its own level, it is basically saying my idea for me living and carrying my own life and protecting my own life, there is a point at which that is absolute folly, that there's nothing that I can really do in the scheme of things to save myself. So Jesus says, no. Take up your cross, right? Luke would actually add daily, and follow. You're denying yourself. You're denying the things that you feel like are going to keep you whole or make you whole, and recognize that Jesus is the only one who does that. So find those things in your own life, and maybe they're in the past, and you can say, hey, yeah, this was something that I thought was going to save me. I thought it was one of those things that I couldn't possibly deny because it was bringing meaning to my life or sustenance or whatever. Okay, so just find examples. This should be a good part of the discussion. Question number 3. Is Matthew 16:24 a good definition of discipleship? Why not? If you boil things down, discipleship we could talk about it from so many different angles, but if you just bring it down to its bare roots, is this idea of denying oneself, right? And taking up a cross, and when we see this written, we have to recognize that what would the disciples be thinking? When we think of cross, we think of Jesus. People have crosses around their necks, crucifixes, and so forth. And we have to think that's not the way it was back then. What would happen back then is if someone was an enemy of the state, they would get crucified and put around town so that you could go and see them. You could see what happens to enemies when Rome discovers them. What happens to those who are seditious, right? Who are the ones who rebel? This is what happens to them. So you must think of it from the disciples' perspective. It's like those who would be carrying their cross, which is on the way to be lifted up and tortured to death. What would they be thinking? So when we think about discipleship, are we thinking deeply enough? Because in a way, this provides a core basis for what it is we're supposed to do when we say yes to Jesus, right? When we look at our King, we look at him upon a cross, And that cross, with that cross, he defeats Satan, sin, and death, and is brought through on the other side in resurrection. And that's the life that we're invited into. But we can't skip one to get the other. There is this necessity of recognizing that we must spend our lives trying to remove our own desires and the own things that are folly, and look to God's wisdom. Because there are some things, by the way, in our lives that are actually probably good and fine. They are part of God's wisdom, and they're part of what he's designed us to do. We find those things, we do them, and then we find the things that are folly and sin, and we rip them out of our lives and say, my life is yours, Lord. So just take some time talking through that. You might have people in your group who would argue that and say, man, that's harsh or that's too hard. Talk through it. It's super powerful to really think about, well, what does this Christian life mean? I can't save myself. And what does Jesus say you need to do? Well, you trust me to save you. You deny yourself because I won't deny you before the Father. Question number 4. What shall a man give in return for his soul is a great question. How do you think an average person might answer? So kind of culminating, taking some of these first questions and putting them together is it's the old concept of you can't take it with you. In just normal parlance, or even taking Jesus out of the equation, think about what people would say. Because I think, what shall a man give in return for his soul is a question that I think we all deal with at one point or another, whether we are Christians or not. What is it you can really do, and why are you doing it? So have that discussion and talk about what the culture might say. Talk about what you really, maybe you're not quite ready, or your group, someone in your group isn't quite ready to say to take up the cross, right? To deny oneself. So it's talking about what could you possibly do that would actually save your soul? What value are you bringing to the table in return for your soul? What is the payment that is worth the exchange? You see? So anyway, that's another kind of allows you to dig deeper. Question number 5. Reading Matthew 16:27 through 28, do you think Jesus is talking about his resurrection, his second coming, or something else? Explain. What we have to remember is oftentimes when images are given in the Bible, even like prophecy fulfillment, if you look at prophecy from the Old Testament, oftentimes you see near-term kind of fulfillment, but it's usually partial fulfillment, or you'll start to see that there are problems in the fulfillment. So for example, the Davidic covenant talks about how there would be someone who would be on David's throne forever, and that God would be with him, and you see this. So you may see this a little bit in Solomon, King Solomon's life, his son. You start to see this wonderful stuff start to happen. You see Solomon giving over and saying, hey, I don't want all this stuff. Just give me wisdom. I want your wisdom, Lord. And you see how wonderful the kingdom becomes under Solomon, but then you quickly see him start to go down this death spiral of doing the wrong thing. Now, so a part of you is like, oh, it was there, and then all of a sudden it's gone, and it leaves you with this question of a future full fulfillment of that same prophecy. So there are things like that we have to see, and I think we should be comfortable with the fact that sometimes when something like this is said, it's not necessarily, it's not in its fullest sense talking about, so for example, Jesus would be resurrected, right? There are other elements along the way that could be interpreted as this. So talk about those. Like, what could this mean? And then there's the fullest sense, where the second coming of Jesus. But in this sense, there's a temporal element where you're saying, hey, some of you are not going to die before you see this fulfillment happen. So using context, using these ideas, talk about that. Open up to what the possibilities could be. What could it possibly mean? And then kind of try to draw some conclusions from that. Question number 6. In the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah show up. From what you know about them, what might they represent? Who else might you expect to show up, and why? If you've listened to the sermon at all, you recognize that Moses and Elijah, there are very particular reasons that these guys show up. They're the commonality of their 40 days, in the wilderness. So for Moses, he's heading with the Israelites 40 years in the wilderness. You have Elijah, who spends 40 days and 40 nights on his way to Mount Horeb or Sinai, which is the same place that Moses receives a law Elijah goes there. They both have this moment where God reveals himself to them. You have Moses' face shining, right? And in the transfiguration, you have Jesus. So you remember all of those things, talk through them, and talk about how powerful they are. I mean, you have the idea that both Moses and Elijah are kind of being rejected by their own people. There's several times where Moses is being questioned. Elijah is definitely, I mean, he's being chased down by the queen, who is a foreigner who worships other gods, but she's the queen of Israel. She's the queen of one of the kings, Ahab. So you can talk through all of those things and see that there are all these commonalities and why they're there. There's the idea that Moses represents the Torah because he's the one who wrote it. He represents the law. You have the idea that Elijah is kind of the first in the line of prophets. So he represents the prophets. And to say that these two, the law and the prophets, come together in this moment, and Jesus is there with the law and the prophets, and the voice that comes down says, "Listen to him, my son." So you see, in the midst of the law and prophets, the voice says, of God the Father says, listen to him. Okay, and that's fulfilling the prophecy of Moses. And there would be someone who'd come after Moses. So there's so many little elements you could talk about here. And as far as the second part of the question, I mean, it's up to you. This is all supposition and so forth. But think about this. It's like, well, I'm just going to give you an example. And again, you don't need to go far down this path. But why isn't King David there? And I think the easiest answer is because the king is there. The one who does stand in the line, the one who would be on the throne forever and ever, the one who would take up that mantle and do it right. He's been called Son of David a couple times already. You see, man, it's super powerful. So there's a reason why just those two guys are there. Okay. Question number 7. This is not the first time we hear a voice from heaven. Read Matthew 3:13 through 17. Compare the two scenes. Why are these two moments significant? Now read Luke 8:28 through 36. Verses 30 and 31 provide a helpful addition. First of all, you'll notice that the Luke reference should be chapter 9:28 through 36. So I apologize for that error. But what you're going to see here is it's comparing the Jesus's baptism and the voice that comes down. I want you to look at what God the Father says, a voice that's coming out. What is it saying? And then the voice in the cloud here in the Transfiguration, what is it saying? And then you can look at those. There is this idea that's brought out probably in the sermon in a very small way, which is in Luke's gospel, it actually talks about what Elijah and Moses and Jesus are talking about. And they're discussing his departure. And in Greek, that word literally is exodus. So you have another one of these linking thoughts to, so he's about to go to Jerusalem, right? So Jesus is heading to Jerusalem to basically do what he had planned to do from the beginning, right? And it talks about how Elijah and Moses are there talking to him about this exodus, this departure, right? So you know that this is a big deal. So compare those scenes and discuss, some of the, it's powerful imagery. So take a chance or take a moment to look through those things. Question number 8. Elijah was discussed last session as well. What was said in that session that Jesus implicitly addresses here? What does this say about the disciples' understanding of Jesus? Well, in the last session, there's the who do you say I am, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And one of the answers is Elijah, right? And here it's clear that Jesus is, if it hadn't been clear previously with some of the imagery of John the Baptist and Elijah overlapping, here it's being very, very clear that no, he's not the same person, right? Because you have him talking about Elijah as he closes out this story. And you'll see that there is this what's called bracketing of this idea of suffering and death, and then the transfiguration, and then an idea of suffering and death. And in this case, he's talking about John the Baptist, how people did whatever they wanted with him, and he was rejected as well. So, ultimately, this is just bringing us to the point that we need God's glory. We need to see God for who he really is in order to empower us for the path, because that path includes suffering. this is the whole misunderstanding that Peter didn't get. The fact that he confesses Jesus and then a second later is saying, no, 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 you're not going to go do what you said you're going to do. He's misunderstanding the whole vocation of the Messiah, what the Messiah has come to do, what the Messiah needed to do. And that's the point, is he didn't just need to defeat the enemy that was right there with their thumb on Israel. He came to destroy the enemy once and for all. And that's why we talk about the gospel. That's Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. He conquers Satan, sin, and death. He just on our behalf destroys them. And that allows us to live in the same path. We see his glory, which enables us to actually live this out. Because if you don't, I mean, let's be real honest. If you don't see Jesus for who he really is, if he's just a really powerful, good man, if he's just a good teacher or whatever, it's not enough. You are not going to give your life for the one who is just a teacher, a good man. This is the incarnate one. This is Messiah. And I think we have to, that has to sink into our bones for us to proceed. And that's where the gospel motivation comes in. What I want you to get at is the fact that when we see Jesus for who he truly is, then it's much easier for us to say, I need to deny myself. I need to pick up my torture device, the thing that would lead to death, and follow. Because even though that is death, it leads to ultimate life and ultimate hope. So the point is, what is it? Look around your group and ask them, what is it that you have not been denying? What is the thing that you feel like you haven't been empowered to do? Because if you have an appropriate view of Jesus, then that will empower you, because we get a glimpse of his glory. We see this, and as readers of the Bible, right, knowing what the cross is pointing to, even before the disciples do, they think it's pointing to ultimate death, not like the ultimate sacrifice, but they're not seeing the other side, which is Jesus is opening the way for all of us to return and be reconciled and redeemed. So when we recognize that, it allows us, okay, I'm going to get on my knees. And I'm going to submit more than I ever have. I'm going to call out the things in my life that they're not me denying myself. They're me grabbing a hold of all the things that I think that will keep me alive, all the things that will keep me good, all the things that will give me joy and comfort and pleasure. I'm going to grab a hold of those. No, 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 no. When we follow this king, we start to recognize all of those are ash. They're not worth holding on to. So we hold on to the right things, the things that he would call us into, and we let go of all those things we think would save us or somehow bring us this little temporary pittance of joy in this life. And we look to the real joy that's ahead of us. We look to the one who those three disciples saw as the one who had been changed in front of their eyes. They saw the glory. And there's this thing, Peter, think of Peter. Peter wants this to continue. He's like, let me build some shelters for us because this is good stuff, right? It's like you see Peter, while it seems kind of silly and ignorant, and it probably is, there's this part of Peter that you can think about and you're like, yes, he just wants to hold on to this image of the king in his glory with the representatives of law and prophets. This is it. He's seeing this image and he wants to take hold and grab onto it and not let go. We need to do the same, and we live on the other side of the crucifixion and resurrection. So we have seen these things from a different angle. And I pray that you would carry that with you this week and that you would help your group carry that with them, because that's how we can actually be empowered to deny ourselves. We've been given the very spirit of this living God to help us to deny those things that are not necessary, the things that we'd find comfort and value in that are not. And we'd look to the one who brings all the value, who brings all the reconciliation, the redemption, and brings us back into the throne room. So I pray that your groups go well. I pray that the spirit of that living God is with you in the middle of all of your discussions. I'll see you next time.